Welcome back for the last session of the Golden Coaches Clinic of day one. This afternoon we're very lucky to have leaders in human science and technology presenting to us. First to present is Sebastian Weber, Head of Human Performance, INSCYD. Sebastian has been a head coach in professional endurance sports for more than 12 years, becoming the head sports scientist of the T-Mobile professional cycling team at only 28 years old. His training methods helped his athletes to victories at the Tour de France, Giro d'Italia, and World Championship and Olympic Games. Having worked as a consultant for the French Swimming Federation, Sebastian is the project leader of INSCYD, the world's first software to analyze physiological and metabolic performance metrics. Please welcome to the stage, Sebastian Weber.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming from the coffee break. I hope you enjoyed and are fresh again for the last two sessions here. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so as you have heard, my primary background from years ago is in other endurance sports like cycling and triathlon. However, since a couple of years, I work in swimming, for example, for the French Federation as a performance consultant on the testing. And even though I'm officially speaking here for INSCYD, the next 30 minutes I would like to take the time to, talk a little bit about some fundamental metrics on analytics of physiological performance. And talking about physiological performance analytics, what we are trying to do, or why are we doing this? What are you trying to achieve when you want to analyze human performance is actually you want to understand why an athlete is performing how he or she is performing, right? So no matter what it is, no matter if it's metabolic analysis or you just want to understand the mood of your athlete or it's a sophisticated metabolic analysis, it's all about understanding what might be the impact on performance of the system. So in other words, what you're doing is you want to analyze the performance of an athlete and then from there come up to make an informed decision on how to prescribe a specific training. I mean, that's pretty fundamental. It's nothing new that I'm saying here, right? And then once you train an athlete, you repeat that and analyze again, understand the outcome, understanding the outcome of the training, and therefore manipulate the training program and keep going and going and going in order to improve and make this process better, right? That's like the concept of continuous improvement. And so what you're facing is regular analyzing sessions, analyzing the performance of your athletes. How often would you want to do that? Well, depending on what you're training for, what you're trying to do in training, maybe if it's just a base training session, you're trying to build some fundamental metabolic capacities, maybe you want to test or reassess athletic performance every 12 weeks. Maybe every 8 weeks, or if you're just trying to focus on something very specific, improving technique, saving energy, maybe you want to test every 4 weeks. So the question that we need to ask is, what kind of assessment can you really do to analyze the performance of your athlete and the progress he or she is making? And the first and foremost simple thing to do, obviously, is measuring the speed, because that is what it comes down to, right? We can do all fancy thing. At the end of the day, the guy who wins is the guy who's fastest, right? So that's one thing you want to do. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, then you might be doing something like very old school, so to speak, lactate testing to have some physiological metric of your athlete. And if you want to take it one step further, you may be even doing some kind of metabolic analyzing using a VO2 machine in the pool, in the flume, either after the effort or like shown here with the snorkel, right? And why you're doing that is because we want to understand how the performance the athlete shows is actually created. And what do I mean by that? Well, you could have two performances, so to speak, that could be on 2 different days, separated by a block of training you may be prescribed, or it could be even two different athletes here. Basically, same performance in terms of same distance, same time. So what we want to understand here is how is this performance created? How is it composed, right? In order to understand which system we need to tweak. And the first layer we want to look at is, well, maybe on this day, to swim that distance and this time, so at that speed, there's a certain amount of energy needed. And maybe in another athlete or on another day, he has the same performance, but maybe his energy demand is different. So what you would see here is an improvement of economy or efficiency, basically saying, to swim the same speed over the same distance, you need less energy, so you're more economic, right? Spending less energy. So that's the first layer you would want to understand. And now you want to ask the question, how is this energy created? How is it composed? Because back to school, so to speak, first page of any exercise physiology books, there are 3 ways how the muscle can produce energy. It's by breaking down creatine phosphate, glycolysis, and oxidative phosphorylation, so aerobic metabolism. Well, and guess what? This is how the performance is composed. So this effort will show some kind of energy demand, and this energy will be produced in some way. But this doesn't mean that it's always the same. So on another day after a specific training, maybe it is composed in a totally different composition here, right? And this is what you would really want to understand in order to understand how your training has worked out, to understand what kind of adaptation did your training that you as a coach prescribed, what kind of adaptations did this actually trigger. Now you can tell me, Sebastian, I don't care, because at the end of the day, these 2 guys or these 2 occasions at the same time, so they didn't improve, so I don't care. Well, I do care, because if you understand which training triggered these different adaptations, an increase or decrease in aerobic or anaerobic capacity, so to speak, if you understand that, you put your training program next to that and understand which kind of training triggered that, you may be able one day to combine those performances and thereby have a higher power energy output and therefore swim faster. And that's what you ultimately want to do. So this is a little high-level way of look at things. Let's do a little more practical approach. As I said, I work in the field of performance analytics with some different sports, and bringing this example to you from 3 different swimmers. So we're looking at 3 different swimmers here, similar body weight, 100-meter butterfly, similar time, and we're looking at something like simple lactate values, right, before and afterwards. So you can see 3 similar swimmers, totally different lactate levels after the effort. What is the call here? What is the cause? What is the comment? What are we looking at here? Well, I tell you, I have received feedback from a coach saying like, okay, well, this guy probably, swimmer 1 he's tired because he's not able to activate his lactate system. Swimmer 2, he might be not in shape because this value is much higher than expected. And swimmer 3, yeah, that's about right. And I have no idea, right? I'm just looking at the data. I have no idea if this is true or not. But there's another way to look at things. And another way to look at things is what you could do. You could take the delta lactate, so look at how much lactate is accumulated, and then divide it by the time, so you get an accumulation rate. And why you want to do that? Well, back to our textbook, this time page 2 of our exercise physiology textbook, you can see that whenever you produce lactate, there's energy production or power production associated with it, absolutely proportional. So when you do that, what you can do, you can calculate the power or the energy that's coming from this glycolytic system, and therefore easily calculate how much of the total energy that is needed to swim that 100 meters is coming from the glycolytic system. And then your interpretation might be, well, swimmer number 1 actually has a low glycolytic contribution. Swimmer number 2 has a high contribution, and swimmer number 3 has a mediocre contribution of energy from the glycolytic system. And so back to training, that might be might trigger the answer that swimmer number 2, you maybe want to put an emphasis on more aerobic training or development of the aerobic system because his glycolytic system seems to be pretty good developed. And swimmer number 1, it's obviously the opposite, right? He maybe should put a focus on a higher glycolytic adaptation. And this brings us to another question. What is the actual glycolytic power or anaerobic capacity of these athletes? So this is how much energy they retrieve from this system during the effort. You can look at it in a different way, taking it one level further down, more into the details, and say, okay, this is what we just looked at. This is the energy contribution. Now let's look at the maximum power or capacity of the glycolytic system. And now what you can see is that swimmer number 1 actually is not doing too bad. He has a pretty high glycolytic ability to produce energy, but he's not utilizing this. So that is a second level analysis where you can say, okay, swimmer number 1 is actually not having a too low developed glycolytic system. He's not able to activate it. He's not tapered right. His buffering capacity is so low he can't stand the effort. Some examples. Swimmer number 3, in contrast to that, uses or retrieves a lot of energy from his glycolytic system, even though his maximum capacity is much lower. So what I'm saying here is it's not only about how good the system is trained, but especially with the glycolytic system, how much of that you can use. Again, buffering and activation. This is why we're doing tapering. So obviously, going 3 slides back, just looking at the lactate levels, you would not be able to see that, right? If you take it down these 2 levels, then you have a much, much better understanding on where the energy is coming from and how this relates to the maximum capacity of the athlete. Okay? So what we are trying to do is get a very holistic and more complete picture of the performance of an athlete, or we call it a metabolic profile. And what do I mean with a metabolic profile? So what we are capturing here is, for example, aerobic capacity, obviously, the aerobic system, aerobic power output, so to speak. The same for the anaerobic or glycolytic system. And then, of course, very important in swimming, as in other sports we are working in running, for example, we do this with the Stanford University for Running Economy, looking at the energy cost of locomotion. So how much energy does a swimmer need to swim a certain speed? Obviously, it can be very decisive, as you know. Anaerobic threshold, okay, that's something you always want to have. Then just what I've talked about, buffering ability and activation ability, right? Very important. Obviously, aerobic and anaerobic energy contribution. And, especially like for outdoor long distance swimming, can be important. Where is this fuel coming from? Is the swimmer more reliant on fatty acids or more reliant on carbohydrates? So this is all what we are capturing, and this is all what we are capturing when I'm talking about doing a 360-degree metabolic profile. Now the question is, how do you get to that data? How you retrieve that data? Well, one thing you can do is, for example, do a set of 400-meter efforts in different speeds, taking measurements like lactate at a minimum, or also VO2 if you have. You could also do something like also 200 meters or 50 meters and longer distances, and there's all kind of tests you would want to do to get all this data. Maybe there's even more tests that you can do. Now, the good thing is, it wouldn't be very applicable if you would have to do all this tests to get those results on the right-hand side. Actually, it doesn't matter which of those you're doing. You can do either selection of distances and speeds, efforts that you like. Let me tell you that. For example, we work with kayakers, for example, right? Kayakers do 1,000 meter and 500 meters race simulations as part of their training. They are using these efforts to get this full profile, right? So not interrupting the training anymore by a dedicated testing session, just use whatever data they have. The same is with a cyclist. They just use whatever efforts they have in training, take some lactate data or some other data, and run it into the system. Okay? And yeah, whatever composition you feel comfortable with, or whatever composition is important for your athlete. So normally what coaches would do is they would design the testing protocol based on what their swimmer sees in the race. So obviously, a 100-meter butterfly swimmer, you would test in 100-meter butterfly, and a 200-meter freestyle, you would want to include 200-meter freestyle into the testing, into the assessment. And that's no problem at all. So going back to this analysis here, and going back to the question, how often can you do that? How often, how detailed can you monitor the performance of the athletes? You might run normally into this kind of problem where you see, well, the more sophisticated my analysis gets, the more data I get, the higher the effort gets, right? So it's very easy to just take the time, but the level of information I get from that is not super, super high. And we are kind of solving this problem by, just as I said, using training data or data you can obtain in training if you don't want to do a dedicated testing session, but still get the full amount of results. So how does it work? Well, on a very high level prescription, so to speak, we would take some training data, race simulation or sprint or long distance efforts, just take some measurements, for example, lactate, and run it into some, for the world of sports science, maybe sophisticated data analysis or mathematical operations. And then what we are basically doing, the easiest way to describe it, so to speak, you take the data, sorry for that, you take the data, it's get run into the system, and what is created is something what you could call an avatar of your athlete or a profile of your athlete, right? So giving one real-world example, this is how it looks like. You have these dots, the orange dots, three measurements at 3 different speeds. At 200 meters, orange dots. At 100 meters, a purple dot. And at 50 meters, which is the yellow one. So you just have some kind of data that you've obtained. And then the algorithms will basically calibrate to this data. And by calibrating to this data, we'll be able to have the creation of this physiological avatar. And then once we have this profile of your athlete, we can apply this information to whatever load scenario you want to look at. So let me give you one example. What I mean by that, for example, what you're able to understand now is, as a function of the speed, where is the energy coming from, right? So you could see this area basically here as the maximum energy demand. And then you can see the red one is the glycolytic anaerobic part, and the blue one is aerobic part, so you can understand at which speed does the athlete use what kind of energy system and preference, so to speak. And this can obviously change from athlete to athlete, right? Another way, just some snippets here of what we are looking at. Another way, which is quite compelling and interesting to look at things, is looking at lactate recovery, which is the gray curve, and lactate accumulation. So let me walk you through this really quick. You have the speed on the x-axis and a lactate recovery or accumulation rate, so it's millimoles per minute, on the y-axis, right? And so the gray curve shows you how quickly an athlete could recover at what speed. So this athlete has this maximum clearance of lactate at a speed of approximately 1.1 to 1.2 meters per second. It runs to 0 at anaerobic threshold, right? Maximum lactate steady state. And then you can understand once the swimmer swims faster, how quickly lactate would accumulate. And this is obviously something coaches use quite successfully to design training programs, recovery times in an interval training session, and so on and so forth. Another thing very important in swimming especially is to understand where the energy is coming from again. This is something we just published in the book Science of Swimming and Aquatics by Nova, looking at different interval training sessions. And basically, high-intensity interval training session, where is the energy coming from? How do longer or shorter rest periods affect which system you are triggering more, right? If you do very short intervals, what kind of system are you using? If you change the resting period, if you change the speed of the resting, so on and so forth, where is the energy coming from? And then lastly, looking at single efforts. Similar to what we've seen before, now we're looking at 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters, and 50 meters. And let me walk you through this one. So the dotted vertical lines up here are several records you want to look at, several personal bests, world record, club record, national records whatsoever, right, at certain distances. And then the curve represents the lactate concentration at any given speed. So for example, the green one for the 400 meter, the red one for the 200 meter. The dot represents the measurement, so what your athlete was able to show, right? So for example, in this case, for the 400 meters, about 60 millimoles. And the percentage means how many percent of his available glycolytic capacity did he really use, similar to what we've seen before. So for example, you can see that obviously the purple one, the 50 meters, the athlete used 80% approximately of his glycolytic capacity. In the 100 meter, only 50%. The 200 meter was very slow, so therefore it was low, and then 20% in the 400 meter leg. And the area shows you again where is the energy coming from. And so obviously, the longer you go with the distance, you can see that the energy contribution changes to become more and more aerobically. So you understand if your swimmer would be swimming, for example, in the 100 meter at whatever, not 1.7, but 1.9 meters per second, you can see that he would need this amount of extra anaerobic energy, and then you would want to create a training program for that. And this brings it back to training. What you really want to do, bringing it back full circle to what I said in the beginning, is you want to monitor the progress very often to really understand how does my aerobic system, how does the glycolytic system of the swimmer, how does the efficiency, the economies, or the energy cost of swimming, how does it change over the course of training? So integrate these kind of analyses into the training process, put your training program next to that, and then really see, okay, in this case, for example, the blue one, the aerobic capacity going down. So if it's too low here, you maybe want to change the training program to obviously maintain a certain level, right? So use this analysis in order to understand how the trainings that you prescribe specifically triggered an adaptation in a specific physiological system. Thank you very much.